I'll continue to use the same handout that I've been using earlier in the course. This time our focus is going to be on the final layer and a little bit on finishing.
I actually try to get through those stages fairly quickly. This next stage is where I spend half the time, if you're trying to judge where the time gets spent.
In this stage, we find ourselves squinting yet again, but as before, we're squinting to see different things. This time, we're squinting to try to isolate the hardest edges that we can find in the subject. To illustrate what you should be seeing when you squint, I'm taking you back to the original photograph. I'd like you to try to squint here at the video and to isolate what you think would be the hardest edges in the image. Here's what I see when I squint. The edges that are highlighted in red are those that I find most hard, which means the most abrupt from one value to the next or from one hue to the next. The softer edges I see kind of blurred in blue here, and those are the edges that have a more gradual transition from value to value or from hue to hue. As in earlier stages, here too we have to also open our eyes to be able to see something, and here in the final layer stage we're trying to see those individual colors so we can isolate them clearly from the others that we see. Here's how I described it in the class.
I've got the basic value pattern that I want to try to maintain. I have the average color already there, don't need to change it, but what I'm looking for are the little I'm looking for think of it as the smaller shapes and the changes of those shapes, the colors changes in those little shapes, because those are the things that will give this real life.
My focus on the shape element is somewhat different in this stage. Here, rather than looking at those large value-based shapes, here I'm trying to refine those large shapes by adding smaller internal shapes that may vary a little bit by color or value, intensity, or even temperature, which I'll talk about. The other thing to do is I want to try not to cover up the shadow colors. The underpainting that I typically do, especially in the shadows, have more transparent colors, and it's a little better, I think, to leave those transparent rather than covering them with opaque paints. And the last thing is I want to try to suggest detail here without adding too much detail. Here's a nice summary that I provided in class.
My focus on shapes has now passed. Okay? So my primary concern is not to change the shapes. If I got them right at the beginning, don't change them.
When I'm doing the final layer, my color focus has more to do with modeling the big value shapes that I've established using slightly different colors that are more or less in the same value, under the same value scale. That's one of the reasons we talk about temperature here rather than value. The overall value we want to keep the same, so only minor pushes up and down, but with regard to temperature, we're free to make colors warmer or cooler, so long as they're in the same value family. Let me share with you how I described this in the class.
Ours will talk about temperature at this point rather than value. The value is set, so I can make warmer colors, cooler colors, but keep the value the same. So I'm just making minor changes like that inside the big shapes. I don't want to alter the overall value unless necessary. Unless I've made some mistake, I don't want to change the overall value.
Edges is the primary focus of the final layer stage, so I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about this just so you know what to look for and how to try to alter your image to accommodate what you see. Here we're trying to soften the edges primarily to make them match what you can see with a steady gaze on the focal point. Now this is a tricky thing, and I'm going to try to describe it with a little illustration that I used in the course. Hopefully you'll get the sense that we need to try to replicate in a realistic image the way our eyes see things.
Pick something and look at it. I'm going to pick Janine. I'm going to look at her because she's so gorgeous. Okay? Now if I look at Janine, but in my mind I look at anything else, so whether I look at Jana, right? Not turn to look at you, but focus on you while looking at Janine. I'll tell you what Jana looks like. She looks like a fuzzy little ball I can't even differentiate basically her hair from her features on her face. I can see the basic shape of her shirt. I can't see her hands moving. I mean, I know she's typing on her phone. I can't even see her hands moving. Now, if I turn to look at Jana, she is now all of a sudden she's in complete detail, right? I see everything. But now, Janine has gone to a blob. You know what I mean? Well, one of the problems people who try to paint realistically have, I think, is when you're trying to paint an area, you're looking at it. It becomes your focal point for that moment. What you have to be very careful about, though, is you have to, in your mind, know, is it the focus of the painting or not? Because if it's not the focus of the painting, it has to continue to look like Jana when I'm looking at Janine. So it has to be little detail, has to be blurry, has to be very general. Otherwise, it will become a focus. Now, if you paint all the parts of your painting basically the same way, so that when I look at the tree, it's all in focus, and I look over here, everything is in focus, then it will look like a photograph. It won't look bad, but it won't look like a piece of art. It will look like a photograph, because that's the way that's the way a camera works, right? That's not the way we work. That's not the way we see. That's the way a camera works. So you have to pick a focal point to know whether the edges are going to be hard or soft. So here I have to decide what is going to be where will my focus be? And to be honest, as long as I stay away from the middle and focus in this area here, I can focus on anything. This is where the concept and composition come into play. What do you want this picture to be about? You know, do you want it to be about beautiful flowers on the trail? Or do you want it to be about where am I going? You know, where do I want to be? So maybe your focus is up here, sort of past the tree, so it draws you in. Maybe the focus is just around the bend, you know, right here, the striking light on that tree. Maybe the focus is the light on the, I don't know, you got to pick something. And it almost doesn't matter to me from a painting point of view, from a composition and concept point of view, it's important. So do you guys have a preference as to what I make the focal point?
Did you pick the first two big tree trunks?
These two?
Uh-huh.
How about if I not pick this one because it's so far out on the right? If I'm trying to keep my focal point around here somewhere, I can easily focus on this tree. And it works out well with the reference because I've got these lighted areas bringing you to the right, and I've got limbs bringing you back here, and a big highlight there, so we'll make that the focal point. Mm-hmm. So why is that important? Because I'm focusing on edges. I better not see a hard edge, not many hard edges, except here. Because if I was out, you know, if I was out on that path looking here, if that was Janine, right? Then all of this stuff would be in a blurry little detail, right? The only part that I'd see clearly in focus would be that. So everything else relative to that has to have softer edges and look like a little less in focus.
For a second, I'm going to take you back to this image where I was showing you hard and soft edges that I could see. The best way to think of them is that they are all potential hard or soft edges on your painting. And you really can't decide which they will be until you've decided where your focal point will be. Now that we've decided that the focal point for this picture is going to be on the right side, the hard edges that you see on the left are going to need to be softened.
Everywhere you see a shape, you see edges. So there's potential hard and soft edges everywhere. But I can tell you right now, since we picked this tree as our focal point, the other three possible hard edges that I identified are not going to be that hard. I can tell you right now, because if I make them hard, they will compete with my focal point for attention. So I'm not going to make them that hard.
The last element that we need to consider in this stage is that of brushwork. Here we want to keep the paint thick enough that it's going to be opaque rather than transparent, but we don't want to make it so thick that we're creating a lot of texture that will be difficult to paint over as we make our final decisions in the finishing stage. This may not be the best image for this purpose, but I took the original photograph and softened it a bit just to give you a sense for what we're trying to get the picture to look like in this stage. We want it to look realistic, but generally we're looking for soft edges throughout, as we've already discussed. Hopefully you can compare this to the work that you see evolving as I share snippets of the rest of the course that I taught, and I'll stop periodically to show you some highlights or some insights that I think are useful.
It almost doesn't matter where I start, but because I tend to make things too detailed and add too many hard edges, which I think most people do, it sometimes helps to start at the focal point. If you start the stage at the focal point, put your most intense colors down, your most detailed shapes, your hardest edges, and then as you work away from it, it's easier to sort of, relative to that, keep things less detailed and less hard. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Looking for detail, well, inside shapes, okay? So what I see, and I'm still squinting a little because there's way too much detail for me. I couldn't paint all the details, so I have to squint to find the most important shapes. So now looking inside that tree trunk, I see a shape that kind of goes like this, right? That's one core shape in shadow. And then I have in light 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 different areas that are in light. Those are the shapes inside the big shape that I'm going to try to replicate first. Now here, I'm going to be in my little shapes. Some of my shapes are going to be a little lighter in value, my inside little shapes. Some are going to be lighter in value, some are going to be darker. What I have to be careful to do is overall, I don't want to change that value. Okay? So if I make this read lighter, I'm going to have to read somewhere, there's going to have to read a little darker to compensate, to keep that shape together.
Now I actually start painting, adding those little variations in light and dark.
Okay, now I'm going to look for where I can add a little of the darks to compensate for my adding a lighter value to that shape. So when I squint, I see some darks here and here that are prominent, some darks there that are prominent, and there. So now some of these browns are darker because of the local color, because the tree, the knots and blemishes on the tree bark is darker. There's a little bit up here that's darker because of it's more in shadow. Those shadows when I look at the true color, they're just a little cooler, I guess, than the natural color. So I'm adding a little blue. Well, at this point, I don't think I've done anything that would making that the focal point more difficult. What I'd be careful not to do is go too much further, because if I add too much detail into this tree, then nobody's going to look beyond the tree to the grass. So if I keep the detail here relatively, minor, muted, then I can go back here as if my eye were focusing on the distant grass. This would still be relatively out of focus because I'm not looking at it. And then I could put some of the stronger, intense colors and stronger, little shapes and whatnot back there. And then I think people would look past the tree. I think you could do that. Depending on how far you want to take your picture, how much detail you want to add, that might work, Might add or change it a little bit, but it could work. And if you're trying to keep the focus near this section, that's where I have my most intense contrast. It's where I've got my lightest light and my darkest dark. So, maybe that's enough on that shape. And I don't know, you can judge. Maybe I've changed it too much to have it read as still a one shape with a single value, but I tried to keep it as close to that. Remember, I'm trying not to change the shape. I'm trying not to change its average relative value. All I'm trying to do is to give it a sense of realism, add enough detail. And you know, the way John Hughes said it, I kind of like. He said, keep adding these little shapes and variations in the big shapes until when you step back, that shape reads like what it is. So when you see it, say, because right now I look at it and I say, what? And you know, it could be anything, right? It's just a green blob. At some point, I'm going to step back and I'm going to say, that's a pine tree. That's a set of pine leaves or whatever you call needles. And at that point, I probably added enough detail. So to a realist painter who doesn't want to overstate the detail, you just keep adding the little shapes until, from a distance, those shapes read as the object you're trying to portray. But remember, all of this part of the tree is going to be blurry, even though it's close. And if I looked at it, I'd see it in sharp detail. It's not my focal point. So, you got to remind yourself, those pine needles need to look like Jaina when I'm looking at Janine. And you don't have to blend. In fact, if you rub these colors together too much, you make your life harder because it just gives you more work to do. If you leave some of the variations that might not be intentional, they actually help suggest detail. So don't overmix. At least I suggest not overmixing. The only Monet that I've ever seen in person was in Chicago. They had one Monet, and it was in a large room. And I came into the room, and I didn't know it was his, or that it was there at all. But I walked into the room, and I saw it across the room. It must have been
When was that?
80 feet away, quite a distance. And it jumped off the wall. It was like, holy smokes. And and so I thought, it's beautiful. And I could recognize what it was 80 feet away. And then I started walking up closer to it, and as I got closer to it, the whole image started, it was like the beautiful picture that I saw at a distance became just a bunch of brush strokes, big, yeah. And I'm like, ooh. And I didn't like the picture up close. Okay, it didn't read like it was a boat on the water, and it wasn't there when I was close. But as I stepped back, it all came together. Those small shapes he placed came together. And so when I paint a painting, I try to think of the same thing. I kind of think, okay, does it read from a distance well enough that when somebody sees it, they're going to say, whoa, that's a nice picture. And then they'll come in, and as the small details that I've added, start coming into play, it's like, whoa, I even like it up here. That's kind of what I shoot for.